Throughout the day, of course, we've been hearing statements from the Bush administration that when the investigation does pinpoint who or which organizations were responsible for these terrorist attacks, the United States will take direct, immediate action, unilateral action. The United States will do what it deems fit and proper as a response. And yet, of course, there is also the wider international community. Now, leaders of various nations, as we've heard, have been supporting the United States, expressing their official sympathy. Here in New York City, of course, we have the headquarters of the United Nations. What does the UN, as a symbol of the international community, think? What are the legal ramifications with me? And joining us this evening here in New York is Shashi Tharoor, who is the head of the Public Information Office at the UN. Thank you very much for joining us. First of all, what has the United Nations done in terms of taking an official position vis-a-vis what happened here in Lower Manhattan?
It's reacted immediately, first of all, with the Secretary General's condemnation as soon as it happened, and the Security Council's action. Today, both the Security Council and the General Assembly, today Wednesday, adopted unanimous resolutions expressing horror and revulsion of what had happened and pledging to assist the United States to bring the perpetrators to justice. In fact, when the Security Council voted in an unprecedented gesture, the members of the Council stood up instead of raising their hands to vote. It was an act that symbolized the world standing together standing behind the United States.
These words, these resolutions, of course, are very encouraging, very supportive. But when it comes to the action itself, one of the key issues President Bush has raised in the speech in the White House the other night is that we, that is the Americans, the United States, will not distinguish between the terrorist groups themselves and any government which might be harboring or sheltering these terrorist groups. Now, obviously, everybody's talking about Afghanistan. What is the United Nations' position on this? Do you make a distinction?
Well, every single government of the United Nations is behind these two resolutions. The Security Council and the General Assembly have both spoken with one voice, and that simply means that these people, these perpetrators, have no place to hide. There is no government on earth that is prepared to say that it is willing to shelter these people. We come from every part of the world of the United Nations, but we are all New Yorkers today.
So if the investigation leads to conclusive evidence or credible evidence that this was Osama bin Laden's organization, that it is located in Afghanistan, and the White House decides to go after Afghanistan, that would be appropriate action in the UN's view based on these resolutions?
Well, the Security Council has expressed its readiness to take its responsibilities under the Charter, its responsibilities for peace and security, and take all necessary steps in this regard, which does mean, it seems to me, that if the United States were to come with evidence and ask the Security Council to support certain kinds of action, it's bound to get a very sympathetic hearing.
Finally, perhaps a bottom line opinion as to what the United Nations thinks of the situation in Afghanistan. What is the status of your personnel there? We understand that they're being pulled out.
We have pulled our people out of Afghanistan. It's a situation which in any case has been rather fraught. Independent of anything related to this tragedy, we have, as you know, had war going on, explosions in Kabul recently. We judged it was not safe for our personnel to remain, and we have pulled them out.
Americans, I think, and people around the world have heard voices for many years coming from the United Nations in crises such as this, conflicts such as this, not as a diplomat, but as a man who's Indian, lived in Europe, the United Kingdom, here in the United States these days. How do you react to this personally, as a senior official at the UN?
Not just as a senior official, but as somebody who's lived in New York. I grieve with my fellow New Yorkers. All of us feel very, very deeply the pain that this city has suffered. For us, this is not just a blow on New York, not just an attack on America. It's an attack on the bonds of humanity that unite us all. And certainly no one of the United Nations would have anything but the strongest rejection of what has happened here.
Shashi Tharoor with the United Nations, thank you for joining us this evening. That's it now from New York, and back to Colleen.
Garrick, thanks very much. Well, U.S. medical officials say that massive voluntary donations have provided enough blood for the victims of the attack at this point. But remember that blood can only be kept stored for no more than 42 days, so more may be needed in 2 to 8 weeks. If you are willing to donate blood, please contact the Red Cross at 1-888-HELP-NOW. There's the number for you. Well, at some places, people waited in line for hours just to give blood right across the country. Bonnie Anderson reports now from a donation center in Atlanta.
A day of compassion and patriotism. American flags for American citizens reaching out to aid injured countrymen.
Like many Americans, I just wanted to come out and do something and give back in a very tangible way.
I'll take the next person in line, please.
On an average day, 10 people walk into Life South Community Center in Atlanta. Since the attacks, hundreds have come, responding to a local radio station's call for help and experiencing a broad range of emotion.
I have family up there. It was hard to get in touch with everybody, and scared that it could happen anywhere. Very scared.
Exhausted staff members working as much as 14 hours a day, inspired by the crowds.
I've been tired, but yet they have been spending about 5-6 hours waiting to give some blood. So I get my encouragement from them.
Go ahead and put pressure there for me. Hold your arms straight up in the air. And people are just willing to donate today. That's great that they're coming out.
It means a lot of work for you.
Yeah, but we enjoy it. It's definitely going to a good cause.
It takes 24 hours to process the blood. At that point, it could go to New York, Washington, D.C., or to any hospital nationwide accepting victims of the attacks. For Karen Skidmore, that chance to save a life made this visit to a blood center even more meaningful.
This is my first time. I'm sorry, this is just really emotional for me. And I just wanted to do something, and this is all I could think of that I could do, other than pray. So.
Bonnie Anderson, CNN, Atlanta.
Let's turn our attention now to the situation in the skies over the United States. Commercial air travel resuming in the United States, but only on a very limited basis. Authorities decided to allow some flights so that stranded airline passengers would be allowed to return to their homes. The Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta says the general ground stop should continue at least until the airports are able to implement new security measures. Officials want to implement a total ban on knives, including plastic ones. Only butter knives will be allowed for in-flight meals. There will be no more curbside check-in or check-ins at sites away from the airport. Only ticketed passengers will be allowed past airport metal detectors. The government wants to set higher standards for airport security personnel and put more federal air marshals on duty at large airports. Well, for many travelers, the effects of the airline ground stop were immediate, and they are still being felt. Thousands of air passengers remain stranded at airports, often in unfamiliar cities. All 4 of the hijacked aircraft were originally destined for California. And that's where we find CNN's Frank Buckley. He's at the Los Angeles International Airport, in other lingo, LAX. Frank?
Jim, we are at a still deserted and closed LAX in Los Angeles. A very eerie sight here at an airport that is very busy. On a normal day, some 160,000 passengers will either fly in or out of LAX. Today, not a single passenger was allowed to fly in or out of this airport. This evening, however, we did encounter some passengers off-site at an off-site parking lot. They arrived by bus. These were passengers who flew in from Osaka, Japan yesterday. They were attempting to fly into Los Angeles and were instead diverted to San Francisco. After overnighting there, they learned that they would not be able to fly on to Los Angeles today, so they boarded buses and made the 8-hour drive to Los Angeles. They were the lucky ones because now at least they are in their final destination. Others were not so lucky. We encountered a number of passengers stranded here at LAX, including one man that we met who is from Nutley, New Jersey.
Nutley's about 5 miles from Manhattan. My home actually had a view of the Trade Center. We don't have the view anymore. Somebody came in and took it away. And my family and the families back here are very upset. I'm sure 6 degrees removed, we know someone who knows someone who's no longer with us, because what these people did to the United States. And I just really miss them. I want to get back to my family and be with them, going through what they're going through.
There were heartwarming stories as well of people pulling together. We met up with a group of 4 stranded passengers. The airlines they flew on didn't provide them with accommodations, although one kind employee from Southwest Airlines did provide them with some food and drink. Last night, however, they had to pool their resources together, and they found a motel room here locally. 4 strangers brought together by an awful circumstance, now friends who've camped in together at a motel.
She snores.
You don't see. It was fine. I mean, you tried, the other girl and I, after he left, I go, what are we doing? I mean, we don't know who's who, if they're murderers or whatever, but we got to trust our instincts and stay together, try to help each other.
people trying to keep a sense of humor and trying to pull together under a difficult circumstance. Tomorrow, some flights, some of the diverted international flights that were diverted to Canada are expected to arrive here at Los Angeles, possibly as early as 8 or 9 tomorrow morning here local time in California. Airport officials say they still don't know yet, however, if any planes will be allowed to depart with any of the stranded passengers here in Los Angeles. Jim?
One of the things that you have to notice from all of this, Frank, is the attitude of the passengers. There is not the anger that you would probably expect in this situation were it any other reason.
Yeah, and we noticed that yesterday. People were very patiently waiting in line. When people have their flights canceled, often you see frayed nerves, you see people yelling at some of the airline employees. Didn't see that at all yesterday. People were simply patiently waiting. They knew the circumstances, they knew why they were in this position, and they were very patient about it. Today we did see people getting a little more anxious about the situation because of information that was suggesting that they should be here at a certain time, then later, no, you don't need to be here because the flights aren't taking off. So we might start to see a little more frustration, but in general, I would agree with you, Jim, that people were very patient. It was not the normal sort of passenger who's very upset about having their flights canceled.
All right, Frank Buckley reporting to us there live from Los Angeles International Airport. Colleen.
And ditto, Jim, for people who've seen schools closed, other events canceled in their communities, people being very patient about it. Also, many major events around the world are being canceled or postponed in the aftermath of these attacks. The United Nations General Assembly decided Wednesday to put off next week's Children's Summit in New York. And officials at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank say they may cancel their annual meeting. That's set for the end of this month in Washington. Sweden is calling off this weekend's summit of leaders from 14 nations. Even baseball, sport long considered the ultimate U.S. pastime, is on hold. All major league games set for Wednesday have been canceled.
Well, people all around the world, some of them watching this broadcast, all trying to deal with the grief stemming from the attacks. After all, there are many international victims here. I think Britain is expecting maybe as many as 200. Japan also looking at perhaps a high death toll coming out of this.
Yeah, that's right. Some 46 countries have had offices in that World Trade Center. It's especially hard, though, for Americans living abroad as well. Jim Bitterman has more now from Paris.
4,000 miles and an ocean away, worshippers in these distant pews were in no less shock than if they had been looking on from the streets of lower Manhattan. In this globalized world with its globalized terror, you can be an American in Paris and be just as grief-stricken. Churchmen knew people came to grieve together and used the moment to warn against letting the wrong emotions carry the day.
Yes, we need to go find these people, and we need to deal with them with justice, not out of mindless vengeance and hatred to repay them, but because we, Americans, we don't live like that.
In the end, it was more than just the shared empathy Americans do. Those whose lives led them to Paris are often exactly the sort of people who know New York, who know Washington, and fear for friends left behind. Expatriated, but still patriots, some of whom believe their homeland has been too disengaged from world affairs.
I really hope that it brings us out of isolation. You cannot make peace worldwide. You cannot have peoples living together if they don't communicate. And the only way to do that is to come out of isolation and work together.
The priest at the Episcopal Cathedral here remembered the words of Douglas MacArthur at the end of World War II. If we will not devise a more equitable system than war, the general said, Armageddon will be at our doors. But the words that echoed longest after the prayer service was over were the ones that came at the very end. Words most in the church had learned from childhood, but in a now and forever less innocent world, words whose meaning will never be quite the same. Jim Bitterman, CNN, Paris.
You know, Jim, we've seen so much emotion around the globe on this event. We've seen it in British Prime Minister Tony Blair, Russian President Vladimir Putin. We've seen it in just people who live in countries where they face terrorism, understanding this perhaps on a level that the rest of us just don't.
And let's pause for a minute. Let's take a look at some of the acts that were made around the world in response to all of this, and listen really to what people had to say.
I can only say that all those who have lost their lives, and indeed those who are related and have loved ones who've lost their lives, are very much in my thoughts and prayers.
I react to the families hearing the news, how their lives are never going to be the same. And I feel their pain. I saw that building collapse and I broke down in tears. I was just sobbing because this is pain. This is human suffering.
We are here to lay some wreaths, some flowers, and to also show our sympathy in action so that the American people understand the Palestinians are not their enemy.
On behalf of the citizens of Belfast, I would like to extend our deepest condolences to the people of the United States of America following the terrible atrocity.
My heartfelt sympathy is with the American people subjected to inhuman terrorist attacks which have taken the lives of thousands of innocent human beings and caused unspeakable sorrow in the hearts of all men and women.
The once mighty twin towers of the World Trade Center, now a tomb for thousands.
The search for those responsible for the attacks leads the FBI to Florida.
And also the people of America join their leaders in remembrance and cries for revenge as well. Hello and welcome back to our coverage. I'm Colleen McEdwards.
And I'm Jim Clancy. We are continuing our extended coverage of America under attack in the aftermath of Tuesday's horrific scene at the World Trade Center and the suicide plane attacks at the Pentagon in Washington as well.
But first, right now, we want to bring you up to date on some of the most recent developments in the investigation. That's the information people really want to hear at this point. We do have some developments in that investigation to tell you about as the FBI identifies the hijackers and brings several people into custody for questioning. In New York City, for example, search and rescue efforts were suspended as debris fell from a heavily damaged building nearby. Thousands of people feared dead in that debris, including hundreds of rescue crews who had arrived on the scene before those towers actually collapsed. U.S. President George W. Bush toured the scene of the attack at the Pentagon as well. He'd spent part of the day calling world leaders to develop a coalition to send a united message against terrorism. Okay, sorry, we're having some trouble with, some technical trouble with the machine that actually gives us our tape, so bear with us here for a moment. We're sorry for making you uncomfortable, but we're trying to get it sorted out here. NATO allies offering a strong show of support of the U.S. in the aftermath of these attacks. First time in the alliance's history, right, Jim, that NATO ambassadors are ready to invoke Article 5 of that charter.
It is, and that's a significant move that's being made there. We also saw the United Nations Security Council today, members standing up, a unanimous resolution there as well.
And with that Article 5 invoked, I mean, what that really means is that Washington can count on NATO for for support in any military action. I think we've got that sound we wanted to bring you earlier. Let's see if we can roll it.
On September the 12th, the North Atlantic Council met again in response to the appalling attacks perpetrated yesterday against the United States of America. The Council agreed that if it is determined that this attack was directed from abroad against the United States, it shall be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which states that an armed attack against one or more of the Allies in Europe or in North America shall be considered an attack against them all.
All right, we want to focus more now on the rapidly developing investigation into who the suspects were and where they exactly came from. A massive investigation is focused on two corners of the United States. We will hear more on inquiries in Florida in just a moment. But first, hundreds of FBI agents have also been deployed in the Boston area, where two of the four hijacked planes began their fateful journeys. Sources telling CNN that two of the hijackers apparently crossed from Nova Scotia, Canada by ferry to the port of Bar Harbor in the state of Maine. On Wednesday, the FBI took into custody several people at a hotel in Boston. They were not placed under arrest, but authorities say they could provide important material information related to the attacks. Earlier, a car was removed from Boston Airport. That car contained materials, including flight manuals written in Arabic that law enforcement sources tell us are helpful to the investigation.
At the same time, investigators are combing through documents, home computers, and flight school records in the state of Florida. Susan Candiotti told us earlier that authorities there suspect that some of the hijackers received flight training there in Florida.
The FBI indeed has leads on suspected hijackers that were involved in this terrorist attack. They are still hijackers who attended flight schools here in Florida. And at this hour, the FBI continues to look at other flight schools here in Florida. Law enforcement sources say that two of the suspected hijackers, at least two of them, lived here in Vero Beach. Two of them are brothers that lived here. One of them lived on this very street. Both are described as Saudi citizens. One of them is Adnan Bukhari. Adnan Bukhari, we have a photograph of him. He is said to be in his 40s. He is described as a commercial pilot for Saudi Arabian Airlines. Also living in Vero Beach, Bukhari's brother Amir. Both lived here with their wives and children. Now, this afternoon we also had a chance to go inside one of their rented homes. This is the one rented by Adnan Bukhari. It was searched this day by the FBI, and according to documents left behind by agents, they seized a number of items, including a computer software, U.S. immigration papers, bank receipts, phone cards, a flight safety bag. We also saw a pilot's certificate, as well as a certificate that they had received specialized instruction on multi-engine planes. These pilots, we are told by law enforcement sources, attended Flight Safety International, a flight school here in Vero Beach. Law enforcement sources also tell CNN that the Bukhari brothers were believed to have been on one of the two flights out of Boston, one of those two flights that wound up slamming into the World Trade Center. Also, we can report to you that a car impounded in Portland, Maine, according to law enforcement authorities, was rented at Boston Logan Airport and driven to Portland, Maine. Now, the Maine State Police confirmed that two of the suspected hijackers were on a U.S. air flight out of Logan Airport, again, one of the two planes that crashed into the World Trade Center. The FBI also looking at two more suspected hijackers who spent some time both in Venice, Florida, as well as Coral Springs, Florida, which is located in the south. The two are Mohammed Atta and Marwan Youssef al-Shahi. Now, they stayed for a few days at the home of Charlie Voss in Venice, Florida, and they took courses at Hoffman Aviation. These people both had passports from the United Arab Republic.
What investigators want to know as well, what exactly happened on board those airliners after they had been seized by the hijackers. CNN's Kelly Arena has obtained transcripts of the events in the cockpit of one of the doomed planes, United Flight 93.
As CNN has reported throughout the day, a microphone was keyed open on the hijacked flight that crashed in Pennsylvania. Now, CNN has obtained a partial transcript of what was heard by air traffic control from the cockpit. That's United Airlines Flight 93. It actually departed Newark for San Francisco. It was flying at 35,000 feet over the Cleveland area. Now, at this point, air traffic controllers heard shouting in the cockpit with someone yelling, "Get out of here." The microphone is momentarily turned off. It comes back on, some scuffling is heard, and again a voice yells, "Get out of here." The microphone is again turned off. When it is turned on again, it's clear that the pilot is no longer in the cockpit. Someone is heard speaking in broken English in what was described as an Arabic accent, telling passengers, quote, "There's a bomb on board. This is the captain speaking. Remain in your seat. There is a bomb on board. Stay quiet. We are meeting with their demands. We are returning to the airport." Now, to supplement that transcript, we do have some information on what was going on outside the cockpit. Family members of one passenger who phoned his family on his cell phone said the passengers, after learning that the World Trade Center had been hit, had voted to attack the terrorists. Nothing else, unfortunately, was heard from the passengers after that. That flight did hold 38 passengers and a crew of 8.
While the investigation continues, so does the daunting task of clearing away the wreckage. Many New Yorkers have spent hours searching hospitals. They've been looking for missing loved ones and friends. The city's political leaders warn the final death toll is going to be climbing and climbing relentlessly. New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani says he still cannot be more specific about estimating the eventual death toll. 6,000 body bags have been ordered. The scenes of devastation shocked the governor of New York.
Just this afternoon, I was at Bellevue visiting a fallen firefighter who had been hospitalized, and I went up and congratulated him, and he got this smile on his face, and he looked at me, and it was like a line out of a movie, and he said in this thick accent, "What'd you expect? I'm a New Yorker." That's the spirit that is allowing us to get through this tragedy.
Well, despite the spirit, there are still some tensions running high, including just a few hours ago there was a bomb scare. People evacuated at the Empire State Building and Penn State Station.
Authorities saying at one point they did have some sniffer dogs that did come up with something, but the all clear was given. People allowed to go back in. About 20 minutes later, it didn't last long.
Well, the individual stories of tragedy and bravery only just beginning to emerge as emergency workers search the rubble. From New York, we're joined now once again by Garrick Utley. Garrick.
Well, Jim, I was just thinking the fact that we had this bomb scare here on 34th Street right next to us an hour or so ago. It was a hoax, of course. We've, of course, seen the tragic figures in Lower Manhattan, the continuing rescue efforts, what happened at the Pentagon, and just a moment ago, this very thorough report on the investigation. And the fact that these suspects, who are now believed to have been involved in these terrorist attacks, were operating and living so freely here in the United States, brings us to the subject of fear, of anxiety, mounting fear of anxiety, which is perhaps natural. How do we confront it, and what is it? Where is the enemy? Is he or she out there? Is it within us here in the United States, or indeed in ourselves? So here are some thoughts about fear and how we're going to confront it.
The parallel has been drawn between these sneak attacks in 2001 and the one on Pearl Harbor in 1941, and how both were
a date which will live in infamy.
Except that 60 years ago, President Roosevelt and the nation knew who the enemy was. And since the enemy in Asia and Europe in World War II wasn't hiding, the full weight of American power could be mobilized to achieve victory. Half a century later, the United States could do it again against an enemy who couldn't hide. But now the face of the enemy is invisible, if not as terror and destruction. And we discover the advantage an enemy has who can choose the time, place, and weapons of war. That is what happened in Vietnam, where superior American military strength was inferior to the tactics of a largely invisible enemy and its willingness to take casualties. And the enemy is not always found in war. One of the greatest tests to face Americans was the Great Depression. Americans were fearful about their future in 1933 when Franklin Roosevelt warned that the invisible enemy was within.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance.
And advancing is where we are right now in the United States, not just in the rescue efforts or the investigation to find out who was responsible, but also in recognizing that the very fear of terrorism can become the enemy.
And perhaps that is nothing more than inevitable in this new era we seem to be in, where the front line in international conflict can be anywhere, including the Pentagon, or right here in Lower Manhattan. Colleen, back to you.
All right, Garrick, thanks. And I suppose fear from people as well, because they realize that an act of terrorism like this doesn't require a sophisticated bomb that gets past authorities, doesn't require special plastic explosives or a timing device made in a faraway country like we saw in the Lockerbie case. All it requires is a highly trained suicide pilot to buy a ticket and get on a plane.
One of the things we're going to see in the weeks and the months to come is a renewal of this very difficult debate over how we are going to protect ourselves against these so-called rogue states or rogue organizations, terrorists large or small. As we know, there's been this debate over a missile defense system. The supporters of that say, hey, this is even further proof that these guys are dangerous. We have to spend billions on this. Or on the contrary, will people say in Congress and decide that, no, the real danger is coming from these kinds of attacks, or perhaps chemical or biological attacks. So the question of fear is going to have plenty of food to feed on in these coming years, and some very tough decisions for the government, and indeed for all Americans.
All right, Garrick, thanks very much. And we want to go right now to Alessio Vinci, who is near the site looking over the wreckage right now. Alessio, tell us what you see.
Well, Colleen, it's been more than 36 hours since the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center collapsed after being hit by those two hijacked planes. And as you can see behind me, on top of the top of the rubble there, still a thick cloud of smoke, white smoke billowing high in the sky. Hundreds of rescue workers there, police officers, paramedics have been working very hard at that site, trying to remove bit by bit and trying to see if there is anybody still in there who is alive. The area south of 14th Street has been completely sealed off by the police. A portion of this area is now without electricity, and that is why some of the people have been evacuated. Some others have chosen to leave on their own. According to Rudolph Giuliani, the mayor of New York, earlier today, saying that 82 victims have been found in the rubble. Only 18 of them have so far been identified. Another source during the press conference telling us that 37 body parts have been found. Mr. Rudolph Giuliani, the mayor of New York, also saying that 6,000 body bags have been asked by the, he asked 6,000 body bags to the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Back to you, Colleen.
All right, Alessio Vinci, thanks very much. Jim?
4 aircraft, 4 flights, all set off Tuesday morning, heading from the East Coast to the West. Miles O'Brien traces the paths of the 4 flights, which now share a tragic place in American history.
Nothing seemed amiss when American Airlines Flight 11 left the runway in Boston Tuesday morning. The 767-200 was about half full, toting 81 passengers, a cockpit crew of 2, and 9 flight attendants to the opposite coast. The captain likely planned for a 5-hour flight, so there was roughly 8,500 gallons of jet fuel in its 3 tanks. FAA radars tracked the airliner as it followed the flight plan. But then, about 20 minutes into the flight, somewhere over upstate New York, it turned sharply to the south. Flight 11 was hijacked, apparently by knife-wielding men. Airline pilots are trained to handle such situations by keeping calm, complying with requests, and, if possible, dialing in an emergency 4-digit code on a device called a transponder. It transmits crucial flight data to air traffic controllers. The action takes seconds, but it appears no such code was entered. But in the cabin, a frantic flight attendant managed to use a phone to call American Airlines Command Center in Dallas. She reported the trouble, and according to the Christian Science Monitor, a pilot apparently keyed the microphone, transmitting a cockpit conversation. The hijackers could be heard saying, "We have more planes, we have more planes." Radio transmissions like this would have been recorded on the ground by the FAA.
The police have identified 5 suspects that they believe were involved with this terrorist act, and 2 of whom may be brothers, apparently, reportedly. 2 of whom, 2 others, may have flown in from Portland and originated in Canada.
About 5 minutes before Flight 11 started heading south, another 767, United Flight 175, left Boston, also for Los Angeles, 65 souls aboard. 15 minutes after becoming airborne, it veered off course. One passenger made 2 calls to his father. In one exchange, he said a flight attendant was stabbed. In the second call, he told his dad the plane was going down.
They knew not to carry guns on the airplane. If they fired off a bullet, they could have had explosive decompression on the aircraft. They knew what they were doing, and they knew what their mission was, obviously.
We know what happened next. The 767 struck and ultimately leveled the World Trade Center's twin towers.
I know pilots. No, if you're going to die, you're not going to fly in a World Trade Center to do it. Yeah, there would be a struggle, major struggle.
By 8:20, the third hijacked flight, American Flight 77, a 757, left Dulles Airport outside Washington, again bound for Los Angeles with 66 people on board. Radar tracking information on this flight obtained by CNN seems to indicate the transponder was turned off, which would have made it tougher to see on radar. We do know this. An hour and 20 minutes after departure, it plowed into the Pentagon. On board was Barbara Olson, a well-known attorney and frequent CNN legal commentator. Huddled in the back of the plane, Olson called her husband twice from her cell phone. She described the frantic scene.
She said that they were armed with knives and box cutters, cardboard cutters.
Even as the focus shifted to the nation's capital, a 4th plane, United Airlines Flight 93, bound for San Francisco out of Newark, takes a sudden 180-degree turn near Cleveland. More than one of the 38 passengers called their families to offer final goodbyes.
He said, I want you to know I love you very much, and I'm calling you from the plane. We've been taken over. There are 3 men that say they have a bomb. And then the phone went dead.
The 757 began homing in on the Washington area, its target unknown. But this flight did not make it that far. It crashed into a cornfield in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. Was there a struggle in this cockpit? The military denies it was shot down. Pilots assessing this horrific sequence of events to a person believe the hijackers were in control of the 3 planes that hit their targets and that they must have been well schooled in aviation.
No, these people were well qualified on the airplane. They knew the systems, they knew the navigation, they knew the flight management system, the computers, and they knew navigation. I mean, they went from Boston and right down to New York. I mean, they had to know which way to turn.
Miles O'Brien, CNN.
And as the investigation continues, the U.S. Congress is starting to weigh in. Congressional leaders telling CNN that they're talking to the White House about a resolution in support of the use of military force. For the View from the White House, let's go now to John King. John?
Well, Jim, and we are told by senior Bush administration officials that those conversations began earlier today, continued into the night. They were suspended late in the night and will resume in the morning. What they're calling this is a resolution of resolve, but we are told is that this would put the Congress on the record backing the president. If the president came to the conclusion that the United States had identified the party or parties responsible for these strikes, the Congress would be on the record backing the use of force to retaliate. Now, this resolution, we are being told, is being reviewed at the highest levels at the White House, including the president. Draft language right now. The legal counsel also looking at it because of the precedent such a resolution would set in terms of the relations between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Those negotiations will resume in the morning, though. So will a separate set of negotiations, and a very important separate set of negotiations, this on an emergency spending bill that would provide $20 billion in the short term, $20 billion, most of that to go to the recovery effort. You see the scenes at the Pentagon here. We've seen the scenes up in New York throughout the day. Much of the money to go to the rescue and recovery efforts, the rebuilding efforts, some of it also to go, though, to fund the early stages of this fast-developing investigation. Jim?
John, as we look at the situation with the investigation advancing and the talk about the Congress, there's a great desire, I think, on the part of some people, particularly journalists, to find out what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. But obviously, that is not necessarily in the best interests of what the U.S. is trying to do, is it?
No, it is not. Certainly the administration does not want to telegraph the timing of any possible military strike, although both President Bush and Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld had public remarks today that indicated nothing was imminent, both saying, the president saying we would be patient, we would show determination, Secretary Rumsfeld saying the war on terrorism would not be won in a day or two. U.S. officials also, even as they seek quick approval from the Congress for a resolution backing the use of force, President Bush spoke to more than half a dozen other international leaders today. Other consultations expected in the morning and in the days ahead. The administration saying quite clearly what it wants to do here is build a broad international coalition, including the Russians and the Chinese, in addition to the traditional U.S. allies, to try to come up with a broad international consensus, not only to retaliate against the parties responsible for these attacks, if that can be determined, but also the administration hoping, if there is to be some good to come out of this great catastrophe, to build a new international consensus to crack down not only on terrorists, but on any countries that provide safe harbor to them or that provide financial support to them. Jim?
All right. John King reporting there from Washington. Colleen?
Thanks, Jim. U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft says some of the suspected hijackers were trained as pilots in the United States. He told reporters that the planes were hijacked by between 3 to 6 individuals on each plane. They used knives and box cutters and in some cases made bomb threats. Ashcroft said the attackers also may have wanted to attack the White House and Air Force One. 4,000 special agents and 3,000 support workers are assigned to this investigation.
The Department of Justice has undertaken perhaps the most massive and intensive investigation ever conducted in America. The full resources of the FBI, the Justice Department's Criminal Division, the U.S. Attorney's offices.
That it will be fully operational in the morning, even though half the physical structure is now shut down because of the damage and the investigation. The fire is now under control, although there are still a few hot spots that the firefighters still occasionally have to deal with. In the spot where the plane hit, which we're looking at live this morning from the Pentagon, workers are still on the scene, shoring up the structures, sifting through the rubble, trying to find victims, looking for evidence for the criminal case, looking for the black boxes, the voice and data recorders from the plane. FBI agents were on scene here throughout the day, overseeing what is clearly a very large crime scene now, and they are in charge of it. Officials say they no longer expect to find survivors in the rubble, and their estimate of how many people may have been killed here is now in the 200 range, and that includes the 64 who are believed to have died on the plane. Now, late this afternoon, President Bush visited the Pentagon. He arrived here under very tight security. We can see the cars coming in here. He spent some time mingling with the soldiers and the armed service personnel, with the workers, the firefighters, and surveying the damage. He said that he was overwhelmed by the devastation.
Our nation mourns, but our government will go on. The country will function. We're on high alert for any possible activity. But coming here confirms what the Secretary and I both know, that this is a great nation. The people here working hard prove it. People out here working their hearts out to answer families' questions, to remove the rubble and debris from this awful scene.
Now, during the president's visit, some of the firefighters and the workers on scene unfurled a large American flag down the wall that is right near the area. You can see it here, right near the area where the plane hit. The president said that earlier in the day he suggested that any retaliatory response, certainly a matter that would involve the people inside this building at the Pentagon, may not occur soon. He said the battle against terrorism, in his words, will take time and resolve. And that flag is still on the building tonight. This is a live picture. It's lit up well for all the people in Washington to see. Colleen and Jim, back to you.
And Mark, very important symbolically for the U.S. government to keep that building open.
And that's the point that they want everyone to know, that it will be fully open tomorrow, although people will be doubling up in offices because of the office space that was lost.
All right, CNN's Mark Potter at the Pentagon. Thanks. Jim?
Well, Colleen, the families of several missing Pentagon employees standing their own vigil as they hope for the safe return of their loved ones. Sheila Cast reports on their ordeal.
Tracy Rowenhorst stands vigil as close as she can to the spot where the jet slammed into the Pentagon. She looks for any movement, any relevant detail. On Tuesday, her husband Edward, an accountant for the Army, was working near that spot.
I feel I need to be here with him. If he's alive, then he'll definitely need me when he comes out.
It is a frustrating but not lonely vigil. Eddie's parents and the best friends and neighbors who knew him even before he married Tracy 10 years and 2 kids ago keep each other's hopes up with wisecracks and jokes. That's what Eddie would do if he were with them, they say.
I'm trying to be incredibly focused. If I don't, then I would be hysterical. And right now I don't need to be there. I need to be here, watching, waiting.
Officials say the best prospects for finding survivors are at the edges of the impact zone, where the smoke and the heat may not have been as intense. The husband of one who has survived keeps his own vigil at a hospital across town.
You can still see smoke wafting up from the Pentagon.
As soon as the first pictures flashed onto television, even though it was only Louise Kurtz's second day on the job, her husband Michael started to worry. Hours later, the hospital phoned.
I came in teary-eyed. I didn't recognize my wife of 31 years. She's doing better. She's got 70% burns on her body.
Back at what Tracy Rowenhorst calls ground zero, touched by an occasional prayer, she intends to keep her vigil.
We're just sitting in limbo until they start bringing bodies out, I guess. Either way, dead or alive. And we'll be here until the very... If he's the last one out, we'll be here until he comes out.
Sheila Cast for CNN, Washington.
Well, for some people, the waiting is over. Loved ones walked out of that mangled Twin Tower, shocked but alive. And one of those people was Mike Moore. He joins us now from New York City with his story. Mr. Moore, thank you so much for being here tonight. Tell us exactly where you were in that building and what happened.
I was on the 12th floor of the New York Mercantile Exchange, and I was talking to my boss. I heard a loud bang or whatever, and I said, "Wow, what was that?" And I thought it was a crane falling next door, and he said, "I think it was just a truck going by." And then my cell phone went off, and a friend of mine asked me if I was okay. And I said, "What's the problem?" And I said, "A plane just hit the World Trade Center." I looked out the window, and I could see smoke all over the place. So I went to go back to business, and I went downstairs to the trading floor and handed out some analysis, and then a bunch of people ran onto the trading floor and said a second plane had just hit the second tower. And at that point, over the announcements came, they said, "Evacuate this building immediately. Everybody get out of the building. This is not a test." And it was just kind of like a stampede towards the doors. Luckily, there weren't too many people on the trading floor at the time.
Well, Mike, just let me interrupt you there. I mean, you said you went down to that trading floor to actually do some work after you heard that first bang. I guess it wasn't apparent at that time that people had to get out.
Well, I just figured it was like a twin prop plane, a small one that had hit the tower. I figured we'd probably just continue with work. And then when the second one hit, then it was something different, and we all ran out of the building.
How much chaos was there, Mike?
Well, as soon as I came out of the building, there were people crying, and everything was dark. I guess the smoke just clouded the sun, and people were running everywhere. And I just sort of ran around the side of the building out towards the back where they have a park. And at that point, somebody said there's a third plane in the air, so we were looking in the sky to see if a third one was coming in. And we were just sort of standing around watching the second building that had gotten hit, and looking upwards, the whole floor was on fire, and above that, and somebody else said they just hit the Pentagon, so we really didn't know where to go. And then we were just watching for about 15 minutes and seeing a lot of people jumping from the top floors, and then and waving for help. And then the police showed up, and a lot of emergency vehicles tried to evacuate everybody else, and I started to come a little bit closer to see if maybe I could volunteer to help. And they just told us all to move north, and I guess that's when the first building collapsed. I didn't know, I couldn't see the first building collapse, so I thought it was a bomb blowing off on the first, at the bottom, and we just saw this huge plume of smoke coming towards us. And at that point, I just started to run north, because I didn't know, maybe there was some nerve gas, and I had no idea what hit the building. And then as I got up another 10 blocks, I guess, we turned around and we saw the second building just start to disintegrate from top down.
And at that point, are you in a place where you're feeling relatively safe?
Yeah, I guess we were about 10 blocks north, so we just kept heading uptown. There was nothing everybody was just running uptown. We didn't really know whether it was a bomb that had went off on the bottom, so we just had no idea what to expect to come flying up from downtown.
Did all your friends make it out? Your colleagues?
I don't really know. I mean, I know most of the people from my building were evacuated, and I don't think my building really got hit. I haven't talked to my boss. I hope he didn't head over towards where he lives, which is kind of across the financial center, and I just hope everybody else got out okay.
Mike Moore, you did, and I thank you for sharing your thoughts and your story with us this evening. I know it's difficult. I do appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Jim?
Well, the mood in Japan, somber as well. Attention focused on the search for missing Japanese workers that were employed at the World Trade Center. Financials, markets, and Asia's biggest economy continue to fall to new 17-year lows. Dalton Tananake is standing by live in Tokyo with reaction to the tragedy there. Dalton?
Jim, as you might expect, as everywhere else, the attacks remain numbing to Japanese. The news of the attacks, especially sensitive because of the references to Pearl Harbor that they've been hearing on coverage in the U.S. Now, Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi said he was outraged over the attacks and ordered his cabinet to take or tighten up anti-terrorism measures and take appropriate steps to reassure financial markets. But, of course, the human element is foremost. The government assisting in efforts to locate the missing Japanese workers who worked in the Twin Towers. Now, 20 Japanese workers, mostly from financial institutions, remain unaccounted for. There are about a dozen Japanese branch offices listed on the World Trade Center directory, and 2 Japanese are believed to have been on board 2 of the flights, 2 of the aircraft that crashed in these attacks. Now, here in Tokyo, full operations at the U.S. Embassy resumed today, and there were displays of sympathy offered at the main gate as Japanese joined the world in mourning the dead. Financial markets across Asia, generally those that were open yesterday, are experiencing a slight bounce up. Korea and Hong Kong are up slightly, but the ones that were closed yesterday, Taiwan, Malaysia, for example, off sharply. The Tokyo market kept trading throughout this whole week, and after a 6% fall yesterday, losses are deepening. This day, Thursday, with export and travel-related companies being hit the hardest, but losses across the board in this market. Mike Morizumi is an analyst at UBS Warburg in Tokyo. Mike, you cover the sectors that affect the average Japanese, the growth sectors, the food, those kind of things. How would you assess overall market mood?
Well, I'd have to say sentiment is pretty bad. And it's pretty bad in terms of the consumer sentiment, and in the market overall. I think everyone's taking a wait-and-see attitude.
I mean, is it really pessimistic? Guys are just, at the TSE very, very sour?
I think that they don't realize completely what the repercussions of the events that evolved yesterday actually mean longer term. So I think that there is a potential for more weakness.
It's still sinking in, you're saying?
Yes.
Now, the Tokyo economy, as we all know, has already been reeling by a number of negative factors. Go through those quickly.
Well, last week we got very weak GDP numbers, and on top of that, we've had announcement of a number of layoffs by a number of Japanese blue chip companies. And on Monday, the whole situation got complicated with the announcement of the first finding of a mad cow in Japan, which is going to hit the defensive foods and the restaurant sector as well.
So, and then this.
Right, exactly.
Now, and of course, today we heard that the current account surplus for Japan fell for the 8th straight month, another bit of negative news. Now, one contrarian point, exports account for only 10% of Japanese economy. So some might say the impact of this event in the U.S. may not have that big effect as it might have in other regions of the world. What would you say to that?
Well, that's true. Japanese corporations have localized, so they produce more overseas. And while they don't ship as many goods overseas as they did before, they still consolidate those earnings, the sales that they see in the United States and overseas. So that will impact their earnings here in Japan as well.
What would it take then, Mike, to get a turnaround in sentiment at the Tokyo Stock Exchange in this Asia's biggest stock market?
In addition to clarification on the U.S. terrorist attacks, I think that we need to see further fruits of Koizumi's restructuring packages, some concrete
the movement, so back to the fundamentals.
Exactly.
All right, Mike Morizumi, analyst at UBS Warburg in Tokyo, thank you very much. As I mentioned, Asian markets pretty much in a wait-and-see attitude, volumes very light in the markets that are trading, and with the U.S. market still closed, no leadership from there, analysts are saying they expect more downside. Jim, back to you in the U.S.
All right, Dalton Tananaka, thanks for that report. Of course, as people are concerned about what the future is going to be in the financial markets, they are concerned as well about what is the future going to be in places like Kabul, Afghanistan. Now, in less than 2 hours, the last United Nations aid workers are scheduled to leave Kabul. The UN ordered all of its non-Afghan workers out of Afghanistan after the attacks in New York City and Washington. Osama bin Laden, a name that has been thrown around almost since the beginning of this tragedy, is known, believed to be sheltered there in Afghanistan. The UN says this move was taken out of concern and care for its workers. A UN spokeswoman, though, declining to say whether the organization was worried about being caught in the middle of a possible U.S. military operation. There was a counterinsurgency operation, the opposition in Afghanistan shelling Kabul overnight. Osama bin Laden, of course, the key suspect in the attacks right now. At the top of most terrorism experts' lists, he is based in Afghanistan.
Bin Laden, also, Jim, a member of one of Saudi Arabia's most prominent families. He does live in exile, as I think you just mentioned. And after the attacks, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, Saudi Arabia's ambassador to the U.S., was quick to put as much distance as possible between the kingdom and its most infamous son.
If this case is proven beyond doubt that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Arab people, the Muslim people will help to expose the identities of the perpetrators of this crime. Lately, the media mentioned Osama bin Laden as a Saudi citizen. We in the kingdom, the government and the people of Saudi Arabia refuse to have any person affiliated with terrorism to be connected to our country.
And Prince Bandar also said that Saudi Arabia pledges to pump more oil to stabilize world markets in the event that any attacks should trigger some kind of an oil crisis. For Israelis, what happened in New York and Washington is all too familiar, but as Mike Hanna reports, many are offering messages of strength along with their condolences.
A day of mourning in a region which has seen its share of sorrow. Outside the U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem, Palestinians light candles in memory of the American dead.
We do not agree that terror can achieve anything, and